Hi, this is Peter Carter here. This is a climate change video with a difference. I recently found on a YouTube video by Johnathan Porritt, a long-time environmentalist and writer. He'd written some excellent books that I remember reading long time ago. This is a lecture by him entitled Time to Expose the Evil of Consumerism. So I put some thought into this and then got together evidence that I was well aware of for this. This is a paper published in 2012, and it shows global indicators of climate change, environmental damage, and consumerism. They're all driven by global GDP at an accelerating exponential rate, as is clear. So looking for some definitions on consumerism and questioning what drives greenhouse gas emissions, I do agree that it's an ideology of consumerism as well as the economics of consumerism. Here's a definition that I got from Investopedia. What is consumerism? Consumerism is the idea that increasing the consumption of goods and services purchased in the market is always a desirable goal, and that a person's well-being and happiness depend fundamentally on obtaining consumer goods and material possessions. In an economic sense, it is related to the predominantly Keynesian idea that consumer spending is the key driver of the economy, and that encouraging consumers to spend is a major policy goal. From this point of view, consumerism is a positive phenomenon that fuels economic growth. Key takeaways are interesting. Consumerism is the theory that individuals who consume goods and services in large quantities will be better off. Some economists believe that consumer spending stimulates production and economic growth. However, consumerism has been widely criticized for its economic, social, environmental, and psychological consequences. Here's a pretty impressive chart up to the present time from 1900 of world temperature on the left and GDP per capita on the right. And this is a study done by the Country Risk Organization, and this shows increase of country GDP with CO2 emissions, and you can see that in all the cases of these four countries they're lockstep: China, India, and below Mexico and Turkey. So on to the lecture.
You will notice that I'm not really talking about consumption today in the first instance. I am talking about consumerism, and this is, to me, fundamental. A huge amount of the discussion and the debate about consumption seems to miss the point that there is a higher order framing of how people lead their lives, now increasingly in practically every country around the world, which is to do with the ideology of consumerism. And I want to stress that. This is not some byproduct of capitalism gone wrong. This is in itself a very powerful ideological driver of most societies in the world today. So, to define briefly, consumerism is the ideological belief system which advocates for consumption-driven economic growth, year on year, indefinitely into the future, liberating in the process increased purchasing power for as many citizens as possible. This being the best proxy we have in the 21st century for the concept of progress. Now, you can have a lot of really interesting experiences when you ask politicians what their vision of progress is in the 21st century. You will not, I can assure you, end up very illuminated. Because when I say that this notion of increased per capita purchasing power is seen as a proxy for what we call progress in the 21st century, that is now the near universal norm, the place that politicians go when they try to define what it is that progress means at this stage. So why am I taking that quite hard line, ideological line? And the reason is, of course, that in the last 20, 30 years, consumerism has become now near universal in its hold on different nation states' interpretation of what they mean by progress. It's become the ideological norm in an incredible way. Not just in all the different variants of capitalism that you might like to take into account here. Quiz a neoliberal capitalist in the same way that you might quiz a Keynesian capitalist, and they will still, without a shadow of doubt, default to the notion that prosperity will emerge as a consequence of more people being able to consume more on the planet today. Go to various variants of socialism, if you can find them, quite difficult, but I use Jeremy Corbyn these days as my stand-in huggable nearest thing we've got to socialism at the moment. And if you deconstruct Jeremy Corbyn's view of what progress looks like, lurking behind it you will find an incredibly old-fashioned Marxist notion of productivism, which is that the people will be better when they are enabled to produce more, and of course, if people are producing more, guess what? They have to consume more. So this is when I call it near universal. There are obviously a few exceptions to this, countries that do not subscribe to this dominant ideological worldview, but they are few and far between. And not only that, there are very few political parties that subscribe to a different route to progress. In fact, the green parties of the world are still practically the only mainstream, near mainstream, in some places, mainstream way of understanding what a different ideological approach would look like. So that's my starting point, is that this is our context. It may not be comfortable. You may not like it as individuals. You may not like it as citizens voting in this country or any other country. But this is the context that we are working in. And it's now become so embedded in all the institutions of our society and economy that I think the hypothesis that consumerism is the principal enemy of ethical consumption is at least worth exploring. I don't find enough people wanting to get into that kind of debate, to be absolutely honest. So we've had this gathering momentum behind consumption-driven economic growth for the best part of 60 years now. What do we know 60 years on? This is only a 35-minute lecture, so don't worry. What do we know 60 years after? So we could spend a lot of time talking about climate change to evidence that, because truly, climate change does get worse and worse every year, and what we're doing to address climate change remains hopelessly inadequate in terms of avoiding this potential runaway phenomenon that people are now very worried about, where we reach a certain set of tipping points in the atmosphere and in other terrestrial systems where we won't actually be able to do anything about that increased average temperature growth, even if we wanted to. And more scientists, as you will know, in the field of climatology in particular, are very anxious about how much closer we get to those tipping points every year. And that's one of the sort of metrics of concern that you have when you live in that community, the climate community, which is how close are we to these tipping points, and therefore how close are we to the irreversibility moment where even if we wanted to do something about it, it wouldn't make any difference. So we could talk a lot about that. It is an existential threat to the future of humankind. It's not just another serious threat to humankind. If we don't get on top of this now, and we have runaway, irreversible climate change, to all intents and purposes, everything we know about what makes life good for human beings and what allows us to hypothesize about civilizations in the future, all gone, just gone. So that's quite bad, but I'm not going to talk about that because I want to actually go back to a slightly different approach to this, which is to try and look at this stuff more holistically, because I'm not blaming the climate scientists and I'm not blaming the politicians, but the consequence of our growing focus on climate change means we have taken our eye off the ball about what is happening by way of the attrition of the natural world and the ecosystems on which we depend. And we're far less well informed and concerned and active around those concerns than perhaps we should be. So a couple of months ago, there was a publication of a new warning, World Scientists Warning to Humanity, a second notice. Now, I follow this stuff quite closely. I read my first warning to humanity back in 1972 when I read The Blueprint for Survival, and that was enough for me, frankly. I thought that would probably send enough signals to enough people to change our ways, even before we really knew what the consequence of our ways would be. But no. But I still am a bit hooked on these large-scale warnings to humanity. And this is a second notice because it's the 25th anniversary of the first warning to humanity, which was issued by a huge number of scientists in 1992. There was a big meeting in Rio de Janeiro at the Earth Summit, which I attended. And out of that, thousands and thousands of scientists, 99 of the 196 living Nobel laureates signed and were active in promoting that statement. I still can't quite work out why they couldn't get the 100th, but anyway, they got to 99 out of 196 living Nobel laureates from many, many different disciplines, obviously, and thousands of other scientists coming in behind it. So 25 years on, the Union of Concerned Scientists has issued a bit of an update, progress report. Has things gone since we gathered that amazing combined voice of science in the world back in 1992? And just referring briefly back to 1992, what they say is in their manifesto at that time, in 1992, they showed then that humans were on a collision course with the natural world. They expressed concern about current, impending, or potential damage involving ozone depletion, freshwater availability, marine fishery collapses, ocean dead zones, forest loss, biodiversity destruction, climate change, and continued human population growth. They proclaimed at that time that fundamental changes were urgently needed to avoid the consequences that our present course would bring. Okay, so you have an absolutely standard, joined up analysis about how the pressures of our dominant economic system were eroding already the natural systems, the life support systems on which we depend. Okay, so this is bringing it up to date. Since 1992, with the exception of stabilizing the stratospheric ozone layer, and let's notch that one up, okay, because that's a biggie. And it was done by smart political intervention involving absolutely brilliant science. With the exception of stabilizing the stratospheric ozone layer, humanity has failed to make progress in solving these foreseen environmental challenges. And alarmingly, most of them are getting far worse, and they have sets of data to demonstrate the speed with which they're getting worse. Especially troubling is the current trajectory of catastrophic anthropogenic climate change, but we should be equally concerned about levels of deforestation and agricultural production with its increasing emphasis on farming ruminants for meat consumption. Moreover, in the process, we've unleashed a mass extinction event, the sixth in roughly 540 million years, wherein many current life forms could be annihilated or at least committed to extinction by the end of the century. So, 25 years on, the honest answer to what have we done in the intervening period, apart from the stratospheric ozone layer, is Sodor. Near to Sodor. And if you read core documents in this area, like the Living Planet report that comes out every 2 years from WWF, you will see literally all the data sets regarding our impact on the natural world. All of them, all heading in the wrong direction still. So please don't have any comfort whatsoever that at that very high level, which is our ability to protect the natural world against some of the consequences of consumption-driven economic growth, of consumerism, please don't think that cumulatively we've made any difference whatsoever. Because we haven't. Now, that's a little harsh. We are responding to this stuff now. We are seeing good stuff happen all over the place. In particular, we are seeing astonishingly exciting interventions by government, innovators, businesses, citizens about the journey, the decarbonisation journey that we now need to take. In the last 10 years, technology has changed on so many different fronts that you can now, without feeling a little bit embarrassed, you can talk about a near zero carbon world within the course of the next 20 to 25 years. Near zero carbon from an energy perspective, not from a land use perspective, I'm sorry to say, but from an energy perspective. That is incredibly exciting. It is a game changer, and many people are very focused on that, which is great. We've seen increasing interest from economists, who by and large remain, in my opinion, part of the problem rather than part of the solution. And most economists, in my opinion, should be compulsorily retrained as to what reality really looks like. But I don't want to offend any individual economists out there, because I'm sure you wouldn't be here if you didn't have a slightly quirky view of what economics is all about. But economists have done some quite useful things. They've started to explore over the period of time increasingly sophisticated ways of internalizing some of the externalized costs so that our markets work more efficiently. They've been quite smart in bringing forward ideas about natural capital valuation, how we could develop a balance sheet approach to the natural world, which would allow us to manage it more intelligently, because we'd actually see that the depletion of the natural capital assets on which our lives depend isn't really very smart, even though it may generate short-term economic growth. And they've been quite good about bringing forward ideas around things like the circular economy and so on. So let's hear it for the handful of economists who are actually doing some vaguely intelligent work out there, which is great. But when you look at this stuff, especially when you look at the impact of technology in transforming energy systems and transportation systems, just remember one thing. Everything that is happening around electric vehicles, around storage, around smart grids, all of this kind of amazing nexus of very dynamic technology change, all of that is completely compatible with the dominant ideology of consumerism. You're just changing the nature of the consumption that would happen without in any way suggesting that the paradigm, the dominant paradigm, would have to change. So Elon Musk, who is a man who I spent a lot of time thinking about, because he is truly extraordinary, and if you like, the sort of forerunner of a completely different world, and possibly a very exciting world, if you see it through that very positive lens. On the other hand, he's kind of slightly scary, because he doesn't ever want to talk about things to do with the nature of politics or ideological systems or anything like that. As long as he can get enough electric vehicles out there, crack the problems associated with battery storage, be the first person to fly people into outer space and bring them back again safely for $1 million per person, and build exciting things like hyperloops from Washington to San Francisco. As long as he can do all of that, that is sufficient unto itself. It isn't. It absolutely isn't. And that's the problem. What we're doing is changing the nature of some of the activity within that dominant paradigm. And the word you will never hear from Elon Musk, of course, is that we need people to consume less. Now, I suppose if I am critical about the ethical consumption world and the degree to which we've succeeded in grappling with some of these big picture issues at more than a very small micro level, so individual and sometimes community level, it's the inability to grapple with what this word less really means. I have spent many years in the trenches of ethical consumption, as you can imagine. Spent 10 years in particular thinking a lot about ethical investment, which is a crucial part of the ethical consumption world. And this goes right back to the time I became director of Friends of the Earth in 1984. And I kind of watched the lexicon that has evolved around this field with great interest, but no little concern, because what we have is increasing linguistic virtuosity in continuing to avoid reality. So we have, as you know, sustainable consumption, responsible consumption, green consumption, environmentally friendly consumption, ethical consumption, low carbon consumption, low impact consumption, one planet consumption. I have got a lexicon of about 40 variants of this particular notion, and full marks to people for getting increasingly inventive from a linguistic point of view. Basically, what we've gone for during that time is anything that wards off the dawning of a much more inconvenient conclusion, or insight, if you like, which is that continuing consumption-driven economic growth is not compatible with sustainable lives for 9 billion people on this planet. Underlined. Just not compatible. And that, of course, is a very inconvenient conclusion. Very inconvenient. Even people who live in this world, in the world of sustainability or the world of thinking through different patterns of production and consumption, it's still very inconvenient. It's why a lot of environmentalists will not go to that place to challenge the overarching dominant ideology. So I've watched Greenpeace for decades dance around this uncomfortable reality, and they will stick it to anyone they can, particularly if they're big, heaving representatives of capitalist systems, because that sounds good, and their members love it. You will be hard put to find Greenpeace actually in any way suggesting that we as individuals are in large measure driving much of this unsustainable behavior, and that we need to change completely both in ourselves and the system that drives all of this. So it's kind of systemically inconvenient to have to address this stuff, which is why we tend to continue dancing on the head of this particular pin, trying to define ever more elegant ways of looking at what sustainable consumption might mean. Now, I don't want to be too down on this, because actually things do change. And as we dig down into this stuff, we begin to learn more, and we begin to see insights that we didn't know before. So, roughly 15 years ago, for the first time ever, the world suddenly woke up to the unfortunate reality that more than a third of the food that we grow on this planet never ends up in a person's stomach. So, again, it's essentially a complete waste of activity and effort and inputs and everything else, because it doesn't achieve the purpose for which it was grown. Added to that, we now know that about 1/3 of adults on this planet, about 1.8 billion people, are overweight or obese. And we know that the average global per capita consumption of protein is 36% higher than it needs to be, as recommended by most doctors. We know these things. And around the food economy, we know that the world produces enough food to feed at least the 7.4 billion people we have today, and probably, although I'm a little bit less comfortable saying this, probably the 9 to 10 billion that we will find ourselves sharing this planet with by 2050. I subscribe to the view, familiar quote, hunger is caused by poverty and inequality, not by scarcity. So in the field of food, we're beginning to see how individual responses to these massive macro global pressures are actually beginning to change the ways in which we think systemically about food security and about how we might live in more responsible ways on this planet. And it's moving quite fast, which is great. But you have to step back every time you look at that. You look at this wonderful combination of organizations and individuals doing increasingly smart things about more responsible patterns of food consumption. You have to step back and say, what does that look like in the mass? Not what does it look like in the place where I'm living, which might find it very easy to generate a few pop-up plant-based protein businesses that speak to our inner soul, but what does it look like globally? What is the real impact of that growing foodie movement when it comes to thinking about change in that area? And of course, as campaigners will tell you, this is not an easy one to deal with, because for every wonderful example we have in this space. We know that these campaigners, are working in what has been described as a consumptogenic environment. They're working in an environment that goes out of its way to promote increased consumption. Obviously, if your dominant economic paradigm tells you that consumption-driven economic growth is the means by which societies and individuals achieve a sense of progress, then you shouldn't be too surprised if 15 years into that process we have created for ourselves a consumptogenic society. And you can see that in so many different ways in our institutions, in the way the media works, in many of the economic drivers behind all of this stuff, in standards, in regulation or the lack of regulation, even before we get on to the role of the advertising industry and everything that stands for, and of course the very subtle story of peer group pressure working its often evil ways on persuading people that they are not comfortable, happy, content in themselves with what they've got and they need more. And our insatiable obsession with stuff and with novelty remains as advanced today as it has been forever. Okay, so now just the last few thoughts about my deliberately provocative use of the word evil. So at what point does an individual's knowledge of this state of affairs and the near impossibility, I'll leave a little bit of room for doubt, but the near impossibility of micro individual consumption-based lifestyle changes ever making a difference? At what point does that knowledge become so onerous and burdensome on a person that they have to change what they do in their own lives, they have to change their advocacy, they may have to change their teaching, they may have to change all sorts of things? Because the predominant behavior, to be honest, even amongst those who have a pretty clear sense of what is happening, is indifference, complacency, inertia, and 1,000,001 variants of what I call carefully cultivated cognitive dissonance. So it's really seriously problematic from an ethical consumption, a meta-ethical level. I'm not really talking now about the ethics of individual decisions that we take. They will go on being as vexatious and difficult and not black and white as they have always been for 40 years. There's a piece in The Guardian this morning about the fact that practically every single time any one of us here in the UK has some chocolate, we will be contributing to yet more deforestation in Ghana, in the Ivory Coast, yet more oppression and exploitation of the people in the cocoa industry. You kind of probably have a vague lurking suspicion, but you like to think that those wonderful brand names, like Cadbury's and so on, will be protecting you from the worst impact of your dependence on chocolate. But we kind of know that in our hearts that these things are just part of the bloody system. So for me, the really interesting issue is what happens as this instinct or knowledge about it being too late becomes increasingly incontrovertible. That if you look at it hard, really, really hard, and you do your work, personally and professionally, and you follow through these lines of inquiry, stuff coming through from the Union of Concerned Scientists and so on, at what point does the incontrovertibility of that evidence base lead to personal indefensibility in the way we lead our lives? And the more incontrovertible it becomes, the more indefensible it is not to change in the face of that knowledge. And of course, you get into indefensibility, you get into moral responsibility, and pretty quickly you tip over the line into evil. I just wanted to mention evil because the best document that has been written about the difference between personal responsibility and society-wide ideological commitments, as in a commitment to consumption-driven economic growth, to consumerism, in my opinion, came from the Pope. And in his encyclical, nearly 3 years ago now, Laudato Si', he laid out such a clear line of analysis about why it is that we can go on doing some good things in our lives, but this system, of which we are all small but nonetheless significantly involved parts, the system itself, and he names our consumerist throwaway culture on many points in the encyclical, will continue to drive us towards this inexorable, very unfortunate end point. It's a very explicit attack on consumerism. It's a very explicit attack on consumption-driven capitalism, if you like, much more so than you get from politicians, much more so than you get from environmental campaigners. And I really celebrate that because, in a way, when he describes some of the behaviors that most people in the Western world now are still party to, knowing that they are causing environmental damage, he describes those behaviors as sinful. That makes you uncomfortable? Makes me a bit uncomfortable? I'm not a Catholic, so obviously it doesn't make me as uncomfortable as it might a Catholic. And actually, I hardly ever historically have had time to speak up and say nice things about popes in the round, because by and large they've been massively problematic to trying to make a more sustainable world, particularly in their views on population and family planning. But hey, we all have to adapt to the changing circumstances. And it is for me slightly ironic to be extolling the analysis and the eloquence of this particular pope, putting his finger on this stuff so painfully you can't turn away. So maybe, final thought, maybe the combination of increasingly authoritative, I would say incontrovertible evidence, because it just keeps on growing, as you know, every year. The combination of that plus more and more sophisticated religious and spiritual insights into some of these things should allow us not to become completely cynical about the possibility of change in our lifetimes. And I can say that, obviously, being 67 years old, I start thinking, oh, God, really? Okay, that's going to be quite a stretch. We have two daughters, and they both say, really, don't worry, Dad, when you're 100 years old in 2050, we all know, you'll be banging on about this stuff in the same way as you have ever since we first met you. And I'm also thinking that's a bit of an odd idea, but anyway, I don't think I really accosted them in their prams or in their cradles. I don't want to get too cynical about this, because the speed of change sometimes is extraordinary. And when you get improbable convergences between different parts of a system coming together around the idea of a bigger pattern of change, it can be incredibly exciting. So we should not rule out the possibility that mass movements in the world today, mass movements in this interconnected world, and particularly mass movements in this interconnected world of young people, will challenge the dominant ideology of consumerism. But all I want to say to you is that until that political movement happens, don't look to too much change coming from individual ethical consumption, because it won't. Thank you.